Sorry about that break in the center of that, y'all. Ran out of time. Okay, so this is part 2 of Jefferson. So just to backtrack, Napoleon wants to sell Louisiana Territory to the United States. He's going to sell it to us for $15 million. Now, Jefferson wants the Louisiana Territory because we've already begun expanding west toward the Mississippi. However, if you remember, Jefferson believes in strict interpretation of the Constitution. And well, to put it simply, the Constitution doesn't say that the president can buy anything. Specifically, it doesn't say he can buy land. So Jefferson is now in a conundrum. So, however, apparently he's going to get past that and write this down. On April 30th, 1803, he will make the Louisiana Purchase for $15 million, doubling the size of the United States. And as I told several of my classes before, he's going to quote the elastic clause and say that it was proper and necessary for the United States to purchase the Louisiana Territory. Now, at this point, Hamilton is embroiled in his feud with Aaron Burr, and so I don't know what the interactions were between the two men, but I imagine that it wasn't a nice, how shall I put this? I imagine it wasn't something that they had a conversation about. I would imagine that Jefferson tried to avoid Hamilton when it came to the Louisiana Purchase because, okay, quite frankly, does he really want Hamilton to rub it in and say, oh, the hypocrite, you were all about strict construction of the Constitution, and now, well, you did it because you wanted it, and it's not in the Constitution. So we purchased Louisiana for $15 million. It effectively doubles the size of the United States, and we now control everything from the Atlantic Ocean to the Rocky Mountains. Okay, so fast forward. After purchasing the Louisiana Territory, President Jefferson wants to send out an expedition, and their purpose is to explore the vast new territory. Please write down Captain Meriwether Lewis and Lieutenant William Clark. Just their names, and then we'll get to what they do in a moment. So Jefferson chose Lewis to lead the expedition, and Lewis is going to select Clark to oversee the volunteer force, which they called the Corps of Discovery. So, of course, you've heard of these two men. This is Lewis and Clark. Technical difficulties, ladies and gentlemen. All right. So please write this down. Jefferson's primary goal for the Corps of Discovery was to discover the Northwest Passage. You remember that pesky Northwest Passage, the legendary all-water route between the Atlantic and the Pacific. Did they find it? Hopefully your answer at that point was no, because one does not exist. Okay, you're just writing the top portion and not the bullet. Keep that in mind. Again, as we go through, pause it when it is necessary for people to catch up. All right, write this down. The Lewis and Clark expedition, led by Lewis and Clark, obviously, to explore the lands of the Louisiana Purchase beginning in 1803. Now, the Lewis and Clark expedition is going to lead to all kinds of knowledge that we now use, or rather that they used back in the 1800s to navigate through from the Atlantic to the Pacific. Lewis and Clark are going to set out on the summer of 1803. By the winter, they're going to reach St. Louis on the Mississippi River, where they'll stay until the spring of 1804. Reminder, you're not writing any of this down. The Corps of Discovery consisted of about 40 men. Clark was accompanied by his slave York, who had exceptional hunting skills. Now, the one thing that they needed, however, was the ability to speak to the Indians. In 1804, they headed up the Missouri River in one shallow-bottomed river boat and 2 canoes, and in late October, they reached the friendly Mandan Indian villages in what is now North Dakota, where they stayed for their second winter. In the spring of 1805, they set out again. Okay, you're going to need to write the second bullet at this point because you need to know who she is. A French trapper and his wife, who was a 17-year-old woman, Sacagawea, and their baby went with them. Now, the reason you're writing about Sacagawea is because she is instrumental in getting Lewis and Clark from the spring of 1805 until they come back. She is a Shoshone woman whose language skills and knowledge of the land are going to help them considerably. She does not simply speak Shoshone, she also speaks multiple Native American tongues, and so they're going to use her throughout as their language person. So she is going to be the person that goes between them and the other Native Americans that they come into contact with, and essentially going to keep them out of trouble as best that she can. And she managed all of this with a baby on her back, which is fantastic, let me tell you. All right, so eventually they reach a large series of waterfalls that they name the Great Falls. In order to get around these falls, the expedition is going to have to carry their boats and their supplies for the next 18 miles. This 18 miles is called a portage, when they have to get out of the water and they have to walk them. It'll take them 2 weeks just to get past the falls, far enough so that they can get back in the water. When they reach the foothills of the Rocky Mountains, they'll encounter the Shoshone tribe. The chief will recognize Sacagawea as his long-lost sister, and they will help the Corps of Discovery cross the Rocky Mountains. Now, after crossing the Rocky Mountains, the expedition will continue to journey down the Columbia River. And then in November of 1805, Lewis and Clark reached the Pacific Ocean. They'll remain on the coast near present-day Astoria, Oregon for that winter, and they'll build a fort there named Fort Clatsop. Not necessarily to write any of this, It's just information, give you, In the spring of 1806, Lewis and Clark will cross back over the Rocky Mountains and ride the swift Missouri River back to St. Louis before the end of the summer. You do need this. Lewis and Clark returned with a wealth of scientific and geographic information. They learned so much about the vegetation from the Native Americans. They learned about the geography of the Rocky Mountains and what it would take to cross them, that this information would then become invaluable to the Americans on the eastern side of what will eventually become the United States in its entirety. They'll also find out that there is no Northwest Passage, and one does not exist. There is no way to cross by water only, water specifically, across to the Pacific Ocean, because they will have to cross mountains and other various things. All right, Pike's expedition. Just another well-known explorer of the United States before we were complete and got all the way to the Pacific Ocean. Zebulon Pike will lead an expedition to explore the sources of the Arkansas and Red Rivers in the Louisiana Territory. He will travel west across the Great Plains until he reaches the Rocky Mountains. There he's going to discover mountains that were named after him. So if you've ever been to Colorado, you may have been to Pike's Peak. Now, the rest of this information is a little pointless, so we're going to be moving on. The Barbary Pirates and the Barbary War, not necessarily for you at this point. We do need, by 1805, Britain's war with France had reached a stalemate. This means nobody was winning. The British decided to blockade the entire continent of Europe in order to hurt the French war effort, and the French will respond by threatening to seize all neutral merchant ships that docked in Europe. Now keep in mind, look at what that says. French are threatening to seize all neutral merchant ships. Well, look at that word neutral. One of the countries that has neutrality is going to be who? Hopefully in that pause you said the United States, because based off of John Adams and his predecessor Washington, we were a neutral country, and the French responded by threatening to seize our ships. This is not going to work out well. So in response, please write this, to severe loss of lives in the British Navy, the British began impressing American sailors into the Royal British Navy. Again, write that down. In response to severe loss of lives, the British began impressing American sailors into the Royal British Navy. Impressment means, and you do have to write this both in your notes and your glossary, kidnapping of foreign sailors and forcing them to serve in the military. So what's happening is the British are fighting the French. They're losing lives by the thousands. And so instead of attempting to recruit other people or trying to get some of their colonies to provide people, they've just started stealing Americans, taking them off American commercial vessels and forcing them to become sailors in their military. And between the years 1803 and 1812, the British will impress about 6,000 American sailors. Now think about that for just a minute. They are stealing American sailors and forcing them to work in the Royal British Navy. That's the equivalent of slavery. So this isn't going to go over well. We're already angry at the bombarding of our ships and the cutting them off and the French stealing them, essentially, when they decide to seize our ships. This isn't going to go well for the British or the French, and in fact for ourselves as well. So write this down. Jefferson responds to the situation by passing the Embargo Act of 1807, which forbid American ships to sail to foreign ports and closed all American ports to British ships. That's what you write. The rest of it, we're going to talk about it. You can summarize, but that first part is what you're going to write in your notes. He responds to the situation by passing the Embargo Act of 1807, which forbid American ships to sail to foreign ports and closed all American ports to British ships. This embargo is going to end up hurting the United States more than it's going to hurt the other nations. Our money in our trade with Great Britain is extremely important. And because of this embargo, we're not going to be buying and selling from Great Britain. So, economically speaking, we're already struggling. Now we're going to be even worse off. Farmers from the South and West are going to suffer the most because they can't get their products to European markets. And if they can't get their products to European markets, who are they going to sell to? Because, well, let's face it, if we're all a bunch of farmers, we're all growing things, and we all have to buy from each other now, who are we going to sell to? So this is going to hurt us more than it helps us. This would be a good time to pause, make sure that everybody's got their notes. And again, ladies and gentlemen, I will be posting the links for these notes inside Google Classroom and on my webpage for those of you who aren't in my Google Classrooms, so that you can get to the notes in case there's anything that you missed or if I've just simply gone too fast. Oh, sorry, wrong way, ladies and gentlemen. We are at the end of our notes. All right, so we'll end with the Embargo Act of 1807, and then tomorrow when I return, we will continue on from here and discuss some of the other things that Jefferson did in his presidency.